Hi, this is our second video on the section on data, and this is going to talk about how we collect data in what's called a sample. So when we study something statistically, usually we think about the idea is that you'd like to know something about the entire population, right? For example, you might want to know um, of all Americans, do they prefer dogs or cats? Something like that. But of course, you can't go out and ask all Americans a question. Even the census, which is going on right now, asks everybody, but then recognizes that not everybody is going to respond. Okay? So, what we do in statistics instead is we collect what's called a sample. So, a sample is a subset of the entire group, and the goal is always to get what's called a representative sample. Okay? So if you were going to go out and survey all Americans to find out what all Americans thought about something, and you just went out and asked, 50 people who all live on the same street in the same neighborhood in the same state, you're not going to necessarily get a representation of the entire country, right? Those people will all have a lot of things in common, right? And so they're not going to be representative overall. Okay? And so in statistics, we have a number of different ways of getting a representative sample, a sample that actually looks like the population that we want to do. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay? So the first of these is what's called a random sample. So in a random sample, you assign every person a number or something like that and then randomly select them. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to take a random sample of the students in my class, I might put numbers on slips of paper and then have people draw out numbers out of a hat and get a certain number of people from the group. Okay, so this is a random sample. People are randomly selected from the entire group. Okay? So you might say, oh, okay, well, this is great. And in fact, this is how a lot of surveys are done, even if you're collecting data on the national level. But in practice, there are some problems with this. Okay, so just because a sample is random doesn't mean it's representative. So, for example, if I took a random sample of Americans, say I picked 20 people at random, I could, right? We just studied probability. You could get all guys, right? All men. And so would that sample be representative of the population as a whole? No. And it could really skew your answer. Like, for example, if you ask somebody, how much money do you make? Unfortunately, in the United States, women give very different answers to that than men, right? Women make less than men. And so you would get a skewed answer if your sample was all men. Okay? And so random sampling, although it should kind of be the best, it's only really the best if everybody is the same, right? If you have what's called a homogeneous population where everybody has kind of the same characteristics. If not, you need to be a little bit more careful in how you make your selection, okay? And so one thing that we can do is we can divide our population up into groups in some ways. And so that two different sampling methods that both do kind of something similar with dividing up into groups. So what's called a stratified sample. So in a stratified sample, divide the entire population into groups and randomly select some people from each group. Okay? So you can divide the entire population up into groups, and then you randomly select some people from each group. So like, for example, you might, if you wanted to find out something about the United States, you might randomly select 50 people from each state. And so that would give you a sample that's geographically distributed, the idea being that that way you get kind of a perspective from people from all over the country. Okay? The other way that you can do it is what's called a cluster sample. Okay? And to do a cluster sample, you divide the population into groups and randomly select entire groups. To survey. Okay, so this would be an example of this, say, zip codes. So the entire United States is divided up into zip codes. So you might say, I'm going to randomly select 30 zip codes and survey everybody in that particular zip code, right? So that would be a cluster sample. So in a stratified sample, you take a random selection from every single group. In a cluster sample, you randomly select entire groups to look at, okay? We'll do some examples like this in the next video and talk about kind of diagnosing which one is which and talking about how they work. But I just want to go through the definitions here, okay? Our next one that I want to talk about, and I'm going to erase, is a systematic sample. And so in a systematic sample, you take every nth person. So this would be, for example, like if you had a line of students, they had kind of randomly lined up for a concert or something, and you went through and said, I'm going to ask every fifth person in this line. That would be a systematic sample. Or if you took a list of all the students at the university and surveyed every 10th student on that list. Now it's important that the whatever order they're in needs to be random, right? So if they're kind of ordered in groups, so for example, if you had students who, where every, say you had a line of students where each student was a freshman, then a sophomore, then a junior, then a senior, then a freshman, then a sophomore, then a junior, then a senior. If you took every fourth one, they would all be seniors, right? And so that wouldn't be a random sample. It wouldn't be a representative sample, okay? But as long as they're in a random order, like a line of people, this is called a systematic sample, okay? The last one is what's called a convenience sample. And this literally means doing whatever's easiest. This is the lazy approach. Whatever is easiest. This usually doesn't get you very good results. So examples of convenience samples, and I'm sure you've seen, if you see a poll on a website, anybody can kind of go up and answer that. And so you don't necessarily know who's answering. It could be all people who agree with you. So if you think about it, if you were, for example, an environmental organization like Greenpeace or something like that, and you posted a poll on your website that says, do you think that fracking, that this kind of somewhat destructive way of getting oil out of the ground is bad for the environment? And so if people are going to the Greenpeace website, they're probably going to say, yes, I agree with that, right? And so you could get a result on there that says 95% of people are opposed to fracking. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's representative of the entire group. It's only representative of the people who actually came to your website. So convenience samples are anything where you do something like this where it's like, maybe you should have put a little bit more effort into getting a representative sample if you actually want real data. Usually when people do convenience samples, it's because they don't want real data. They're happy to have biased data because that fits whatever it is that they're trying to get across. So those are the 5 different sampling types. In the next video, we'll talk about how to figure out which one is which and look at some example problems.